Tonight we're looking back at the incomparable broadcasting career of Nine News great Brian Henderson. Australia's longest-serving news presenter, Hendo, as we knew him here, has died at the age of 89. I'll be joined by the current Sydney anchor, Peter Overton, shortly for his memories of Hendo. But first, this tribute.
In the years before TikTok, Facebook and streaming, there was Hendo.
Good evening. Rebel postal workers.
Over 5 decades, Brian Henderson was the reassuring presence in lounge rooms.
Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. 3 separate inquiries are underway.
They even made a song about him.
Brian told me, Brian told me.
Always Mr. Believable.
I know everything I need to know, 'cause Brian told me so.
There was Hendo calmly taking us through the Vietnam War.
Vietnamese reinforcements are continuing to move north towards the Lang Son area, where a major battle may have already started.
The Challenger explosion.
It was the worst single tragedy in the brief history of space exploration.
My controllers here looking very carefully at the situation.
Guiding viewers through the tragedy of 9/11.
Thousands believed to be dead as terrorists strike at the heart of the United States.
And the triumph of Kathy.
Kathy Freeman thanks Australia for helping her make history.
Before the news, Hendo hosted Bandstand, countdown in black and white. He dabbled in air guitar,
Man of trouble, I've had my share, man, I've been everywhere.
had a stab at singing.
Now, I do not exaggerate. I think your singing is just great.
But it was at the news desk where he found his phone.
This is News Centre 9.
The evening news. 30 minutes then, with Hendo at the helm.
On the 18th of January at Granville, a crowded express train from the Blue Mountains crashed in the most horrifying of circumstances.
Every bulletin, another chapter of the Australian story.
Australia Day 1988, the celebration of our nation's first 200 years.
The studio was where Hendo lived and breathed, where he came to life. And what he was doing was opening a door to the world so reporters could tell their stories.
Well, in many ways so reassuring, to have someone like Hendo at the other end of a live cross. I was in Kuwait City. Mayhem had broken out. People were shooting in the air. He and I had just done a live interview. And right at the very end, he paused a little and said, "But Robert, you have got somewhere safe to sleep tonight, haven't you?" And I think, well, that said everything about Hendo. He really did care.
And he was always ready to see the funny side.
I got Mark Philippoussis' pronunciation completely backside up. I called him Mark Philippoupus. Hendo beside me collapsed on the desk.
Sometimes all that preparation wasn't enough.
We're in the dark, but I'll continue. We'll put another shilling in the meter and then come back.
He had an impeccable delivery. And what about that voice? Everything, as far as Hendo was concerned, had to be right at 6 o'clock.
The voice for almost 46 years. Then in 2002, goodbye.
I feel I know you after all these years. I know I'll miss you. Miss sitting here Monday to Friday, 6 to 6:30, telling you the news of the day.
Hendo settled in retirement with his wife, Marty. They married more than 50 years ago. It was a showbiz wedding.
He was also great fun. He loved to drink, loved to laugh, and I think of Brian, it makes me smile, and that is a pretty good memory.
There was an encore performance to mark half a century of television in Australia.
But soon the evening news would become part of our lives, the dramas and joys.
In 2014, Hendo spoke about his diagnosis of throat cancer.
Doctors have been very positive. I think I'm lucky. I really think I'm lucky. And it's an object lesson, really, in checking up and even the smallest thing.
2 years ago, Hendo's last public appearance at the Kennedy Awards. A gong for a lifetime achievement.
I am honoured and I'm flattered. After 47 years in a job that I loved doing, which gave me so much, to be acknowledged in this way tops it all off.
The one thing we always need is humility, warmth, integrity, generosity, and Hendo possessed all of that and more.
The way it is, this Friday, the 29th of November, this is Brian Henderson, a sad Brian Henderson, saying not good night this time, but goodbye.
Mark Burrows, 9 News.
Peter Overton is the man who now sits in Brian Henderson's old chair. And Pete, thanks for joining us tonight. What are your earliest memories of Hendo when you first walked through the doors at 9?
Good evening, Tomo. Great to be on the late news with you, my friend. Look, my earliest memories actually extend before I walked in the front gates of Channel 9. They were at the dinner table as a 12-year-old, sitting around with Mum and Dad and my siblings, and we had a chair at the table for Hendo because he was in our house every single night at 6 o'clock. He was in up to, 1 million households. He'd have 1 million people watching him back in the day. And so that's when I suppose I first met him. And then I'll never forget meeting him in the studios of the old Channel 9 Sydney at the suburb of Willoughby. And I went up nervously and I said, "G'day, Mr. Henderson, my name's Peter." And he looked at me, he said, "Welcome, please call me Brian." And I can still visualise that moment, Tomo.
Oh, Pete, something you'll never forget. Now, Hendo, he was an incredible mentor to so many. What did he teach you about the craft and about life?
Well, as a newsreader and now sitting in his chair, I learnt and absorbed so much from Brian. I think about authenticity, about being true to who you are on camera and off camera, and about, I suppose, attention to detail. And he was a perfectionist, and I strive for that every night. And the people around me, we work hard to be perfectionists because we want to get it right. And that was Brian's mantra. And, Tomo, every night when I do the news in Sydney, I think of Brian because he was huge on pronunciation. And he'd say, "It's not Beijing, it's Beijing. And it's not Los Angeles, it's Los Angeles." And there's a whole book about pronunciation by Hendo. So he's always on your mind, my friend, when you're doing the news, because he was the master, the benchmark, and there'll be no one ever come close to Brian Henderson.
Was that what set him apart, do you think, Pete? His desire to make sure that he always got it right?
I think that was one of the things that set him apart, Tomo. I think he was in an era where television was the only show in town, and for Channel 9, that was certainly the only show in Sydney. And what set him apart was how 40 years plus in that chair, viewers like comfort, they like longevity, and they liked hearing Brian every night bring them good news and bring them bad news. And that bad news could be September 11, it could be flood or drought or cyclone or bushfires. And there was a comfort about having that Brian in your house every night and knowing that Brian told you, so everything was going to be okay.
And that voice had such a comfort about it as well. Now, Australians knew Hendo as the news. He was the news for many. What would you like viewers to know about the man behind the news?
Brian was devoted to his wife, Mardi. It was one of the great enduring love stories. He was devoted to his daughters, Nick and Jodie, and his 5 grandkids. He's a beautiful family man. He had a beautiful sense of humour, wicked sense of humour, a glint in his eye, and he cared, even up until these last months, about the news. When I went and had a cup of tea with him, every few months I'd go round to his house and we'd feed the kookaburras on his deck, but he always had his notepad, Tomo, and he'd go through the bulletins and say, "Now, we could add a bit of polish there, or what about that, or what do you think about that?" And you knew it was coming from his heart and he meant it.
Yep.
And it was like what he was like in the chair, striving for perfection.
All right, Pete. Peter Overton, thanks so much for sharing your memories of a true legend of Australian television, Brian Henderson.
Tomo, thanks for having me. Lovely to chat to you, mate.
Hillsong founder Brian